nothing if not stubborn. Those of you who know me, when I get my teeth sunk into something, I tend not to give up very easily. I'm going to wander a bit because a few folks in here are sitting behind posts, and as much as possible I will try not to be a disembodied voice that you're listening to, that there's actually, you know, a living, breathing, carbon-based creature behind it. So I guess I should have my clicker. Make sure that me and technology are going to get along. Yeah, I think Nick said it well. There are a lot of ways to adopt something like FAIR, and it's a change management exercise. It is. You're changing how people think, how they perform their jobs, how they make decisions. And as we all know, organizations and people very often don't embrace change, right? Particularly if it challenges how they've thought and believed and performed in the past. So it can be a bit of a minefield, but there are ways to navigate that. So let's get into that a little bit. So let me begin by asking the question: what is the cost of a $5 million risk management program? Well, it seems like kind of a rhetorical question, right? $5 million. Well, no, actually, because those dollars that are being applied to what we do are dollars that are not being applied to growing the business or dealing with other business imperatives, right? So the cost is greater. And from my perspective, that means we really have an obligation to be as cost effective in our application of those resources as we can be. And here's another way I like to look at it. So hopefully you can see the chart, but if you're sitting somewhere where it's hard to read, the vertical axis is how much risk an organization has. The horizontal axis is how much money they're spending on managing that. And the curve just shows that the more money you spend, up to a point, the less risk you have. So let's say an organization spends that much money. And on this curve, they're able to reduce risk that much. But what if, for the same amount of money, they could reduce risk significantly more? Okay? That seems like a good idea. It seems obligatory to me, as stewards of the resources we're given. It feels like we should place an emphasis on being as cost-effective as possible in how we apply those resources. And the question is, what drives this difference? Well, the difference is driven by this: decisions. Our ability to prioritize effectively and to choose cost-effective solutions. And as a profession, this has not been an emphasis for us. You do not see this on any of the risk management program checklists out there, not in any sort of explicit terms, right? You'll see, thou shalt measure risk. That's as far as they go, right? And that's where FAIR complements these things. It helps to enable being better at this. And so, but what tends to go on is organizations identify things that concern them, and then we put them in these buckets, ordinal buckets of how much we care. But the first question is, all right, so we put a bunch of stuff in the high bucket. Which of those is highest? Is that important? I would argue it probably is, because we should be able to focus on the things that matter most. And 5-level scale is when you think about the breadth of potential harm and whatnot that organizations face, 5 buckets is not very precise. There's a lot of breadth in there. And so the difference between the highest high and the lowest high may be significant, and we should know that. How about the difference between the highest medium and the lowest high? Again, because organizations tend to address mediums far less aggressively than the things labeled high, okay? But what is the actual difference in loss exposure between these things? Again, this sort of approach doesn't help us there. How much risk is in there in total? Well, ordinal measurement like this will never tell us that. None of the maturity models out there help us with this. All right, the only way to address this is when you're doing quantitative measurement. And then the last one, a particularly fun one, is where are the lines drawn and why were they drawn where they are? And this is interesting too, because I've gone into organizations. Organizations, many of them, and maybe many of you, have 5-level scales for likelihood and impact defined. And what I've done in a number of organizations have gone in, taken their scales, their descriptions for each level, and I've stripped off the labels, the high, medium, etc. labels, just leaving the verbiage for each, and rearranged them, and they can't put them back in the same order because of the imprecision in the English language. I would argue that it is nearly impossible to get enough clear distinction when you're using 5-level ordinal scales, nearly impossible in my experience, to have enough clarity in the description to avoid that sort of confusion with 5 levels of scale. It's actually fairly easy with 3 levels of scale, but again, you lose precision there. You can probably do it with 4, but you have to work pretty hard. Language just does not help us with this. So let's look at an example, prioritization, right? So we've run our favorite tool or scanning system, and it identified SQL injection. Oh my God, warning, 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 Will Robinson. So how important is this? How much do we care? Well, what if it's not an internet-facing application? So threat event frequency is much lower than if it were internet-facing. What if to get at the SQL injection, you'd have to authenticate in the first place, and maybe the authentication mechanism is pretty solid. Again, the odds go down of this being exercised. What if there's no sensitive data to be had behind it? And here's my point. What I've seen over and over again, both as a CISO and since, is we use tools like CVSS and those sorts of things that identify weaknesses, and then characterize them as significant, more or less significant, but they do so in the absence of these really critical parameters, right? So as a result, we end up chasing a whole lot of noise. And back to my point about being able to prioritize effectively and apply our resources cost effectively for maximum effect, this is really important. And again, it's not something our industry has particularly been very effective at focusing on, and it's one of the ways in which something like FAIR helps us to better understand our risk landscape so we can apply the intelligence we have about our landscape more effectively. What about this one? Let's say we underwent an assessment and found these 2 things. We had unreliable access privilege management and weak intrusion detection. But we only get to fix one. Which one do we fix first? Anybody? Anybody care to offer an opinion? It's early, and it's a trap question, so I don't blame you for that. You guys are all smarter than some of my audience. People get into almost a fist fight over this. It's kind of fun and sad to watch. But there are some strong opinions, but they're opinions, and they aren't based on any sort of analytical rigor. And yet, this actually comes from an organization. These are sort of real concerns. And when you actually did the analysis, given the conditions within that organization, there's 2 orders of magnitude difference. Both had been rated on the surface, just initially as findings as high risk. And yet one was 2 orders of magnitude higher in terms of the loss exposure it represented to the organization. That matters. If we'd chosen poorly, that could have a meaningful effect on the organization. And then the whole question of, all right, we've picked something to focus on. What's the ROI for that? What's the cost-benefit equation for applying those resources to that? So maybe we chose the weak intrusion detection to fix, and there are technologies to help us with that, and they cost money, and they impose various burdens on the organization and whatnot. Again, if we're going to be good stewards of our resources, we should understand that cost-benefit proposition, which is really one of the things I like to emphasize for folks is that everything we do as a profession, every single thing, its fundamental value proposition boils down to its effect on the probability or magnitude of the different loss event scenarios that our organization is subject to. That's it. And so as a profession, I would argue we should be good at understanding and being able to articulate our fundamental value proposition. But when we focus on checklists and maturity scores, which have great value, don't get me wrong, but they don't answer some of these fundamental questions or enable these sorts of decisions, that's a huge gap. But if we can understand the effect of improving these controls and quantify that, and this particular analysis comes from when I was a CISO for an organization, and just stepped into the role and identified we had weak intrusion detection, and I thought that was bad, and I did the analysis, and I wanted money to go fix this, and it was not going to be cheap. And it wasn't, and this was in the middle of the year. This was not when you go ask for money, right? You wait till the fall when you enter the annual budget wars, right? The worst time to go ask for a large bucket of money is in the middle of the year. I went to ask for this money based on this analysis. It was the easiest money I ever got because I could explain the value proposition. So in adopting something like this, it's hopefully you're here because you're either at least interested or you've already bought into the value proposition and what I've just been talking about. You've been waiting me to get through because, yeah, we understand that. So in adopting something like this, though, what are the hurdles? And the two most common, and we could literally spend an entire morning going through the different challenges that can crop up, but they kind of boil down to beliefs that this is too difficult. And it certainly can be. If you want to complicate this, you absolutely can, and I've seen it done, and it's painful to watch. But it doesn't have to be. Very often people chase perfect data. They're looking for that unicorn or that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow of perfect data. There are no perfect data. You will die of old age before you find perfect data. And in the meantime, the organization is going to keep making decisions about what to focus on, what to do, and what not to do. And they're still waiting for your analysis, right? Don't get into analysis paralysis. Any amount of rigor, even sort of a triage type approach, will be better than this, or the number being spit out by some tool that doesn't take into account the context of the analysis. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but this is one of the big things. People believe, well, this is too difficult. It doesn't have to be. And the other is, what we've been doing is good enough. It cracks me up that some of the harshest detractors of quantification will say, oh, we don't have enough data, or our threat landscape changes all the time, so any analysis you do today won't be valid tomorrow. And yet they fail to recognize that those challenges are real. We have a very dynamic landscape, absolutely, and there is uncertainty in data because we don't have perfect data. In some cases, we have very sparse data. But both of those challenges apply equally to this, the wet finger in there, right? No analysis is immune to those challenges. The advantage to this and the methods applied to this are that you can account for those challenges by faithfully representing the uncertainty in your data, which is crucial for the decision maker, because if the decision maker understands for a given analysis there's a lot of uncertainty because there's sparse data, that allows them to be more conservative in their choice, if that's the appropriate thing to do. But it also does something else that is really important, and that is, in the course of doing the analysis and realizing you have sparse data for one data point or another, that gives you an opportunity to say, what could we do to improve that data over time? And you can make that part of the conversation with the stakeholder and give them the opportunity to say, yeah, that extra precision would be worth it to spend the resources to improve that data over time. But if it's not part of the conversation because all you've done is said, well, it's medium, you have no opportunity to improve. I see this over and over and over again. And the failures of ordinal and qualitative measurement are empirically shown in all kinds of studies. If you're not familiar with Douglas Hubbard's work and his book, The Failure of Risk Management, I encourage you to read it because he does a great job of explaining exactly why qualitative is so bad. And if we had more time, I could give you some examples as well, some fun examples. But the bottom line, good enough. And the other thing I'll point out too, there's absolutely no evidence. Nobody I've ever talked to in these kinds of conversations has ever been able to point to anything other than, well, everybody does it, to defend qualitative as good enough. There's no evidence that it's good enough, none whatsoever. So, but sometimes in these conversations because if you take this back to your organization, or maybe you're a service provider and you're talking with your customers, sometimes logic just isn't enough in these conversations. So what it boils down to is being able to demonstrate the cost efficacy of this. But the thing you'll invariably run into is, and the other obstacle or challenge we face, is that current practices are free up front. There is no cost up front to this. That's the easiest thing in the world. You require no training. Anybody's allowed to do it, right? Anybody does, right? And all the cost comes later in terms of poor prioritization, wasted resources, and greater loss exposure to the organization. But there's that, nobody thinks about the downstream costs. Everybody's concerned with the upfront costs. And again, there is none here. So one of the things you're up against in adoption is this notion, this feeling, this perception that risk measurement should be free, or at least really, really easy. But our problem space is complex and dynamic. And if you're looking for an easy button, look elsewhere, right? And again, the easy buttons I see people coming up with out there are ridiculous. All right? There's a reason why Einstein said, make things as easy as possible and no easier, or as simple as possible and no simpler, because when you oversimplify, you flat get it wrong. And there's no advantage to doing really easy risk analysis, especially at scale, maybe automating it, if the results are wrong. You're just scaling up bad decision making. So we have to help people understand this. So the elements of a roadmap. Start with why. Because this is a change initiative and people don't typically like change, you have to have a clear reason why for that organization, why this is a good thing. What is the pain point you would be solving for this? Maybe it's helping the board understand the top risks or how much loss exposure it has. Maybe it's being able to justify large, cybersecurity investments, right? It shouldn't be about us enjoying numbers and analysis. I love doing analysis. I like figuring stuff out, but that is not a reason to do this. You have to be solving people's pain. You have to have the conversations with the stakeholders to understand what their pain is, because you may not really know what that is. I didn't when I started. It took conversations and some mistakes on my part. But start with why. And then recognize that there's this continuum for program evolution. And you can, depending on what your pain point that you identify within your organization, the why, may drive where you would start on this continuum. If your board is saying, I want to know how much risk in aggregate we have, or for our top risks at least, right? That's going to dictate where you start. But if you have board support, then you should get the resources you need to make that happen. But maybe you don't have that kind of top-down driver here. So maybe you have some cultural challenges or resource constraints. Everybody has resource constraints. So maybe you want to start down towards the left-hand side, what we call risk landscape clarity. And this is where I started nationwide. And just at this level of sophistication and maturity, just applying FAIR in a fairly superficial manner, qualitatively, we reduced by an order of magnitude the number of high risks we had in the organization. We could focus far more effectively. And our tools was a whiteboard. And just getting my people, the people in the conversation, trained on FAIR principles, right? But you can get a tremendous amount of clarity about what matters in your landscape without a tremendous amount of investment. Anybody can do this, and anybody should, again, if it's important to be able to focus. The next step up is operational decision support, which is quantifying these things with greater precision or with greater confidence. And this is things like quantifying your top risks, the organization's top risks, or doing comparative analysis, what ifs, or cost-benefit analysis, right? And the point here is the farther you go up this scale, the more involved it is, the more resources typically you need to apply and that sort of thing. But the more value the organization is getting. But you get to choose, typically, unless you're forced by the board or someone else, you get to choose where to start, all right? And if you understand, if you understand your risk landscape and the challenges and potential obstacles, then you can be really strategic about this. And some organizations I've seen adopt FAIR, and I'll call out Bank of America, has been brilliant at really understanding their organization and making really smart choices about where to begin and how to socialize this. And I personally have learned a ton from them. I was never this smart as a CISO adopting FAIR. I figured logic should prevail, which was just stupid. But I had enough air cover from my executives that I pull it off. But I made it harder than it had to be. And so the bottom line here is that if you understand your landscape and the potential obstacles and the pain points and the resource constraints, you can choose a starting point, an initial objective and whatnot, and a strategy that can vastly improve your odds of success and reduce the pain and frustration. There will still be pain and frustration, count on it, but it can be a lot less than what I experienced. And then strategic decision support is just these big picture questions. And then the last one is sort of what I think of as cyber risk management nirvana, right? Where we just have our security telemetry tell us, it's like looking into a crystal ball and telling us what to focus on and whatnot. That is today a fantasy for a whole lot of reasons, not the least of which is the telemetry that we have today is incomplete, incredibly noisy, and oftentimes ambiguous with regard to it's just the wrong information. The other problem is much of the telemetry we have is controls focused, which is great, wonderful, et cetera. But as an industry, we haven't figured out control analytics, how to apply controls, how to empirically measure the efficacy of controls. So anything that is taking this controls data and claiming to have synthesized that in a way that stands up, color me skeptical. We will get there, but it's not going to happen overnight. And the good news is there's more to come on controls analytics from the FAIR Institute, which we don't have time to get into today. But the path, there's a path to this. We're on the path. We will get there. We just aren't there yet. So what capabilities are required? Models to begin with. Hey, FAIR. You know, there you go. Skills. People doing this, their skills are really important. I've seen organizations flat fail at adopting FAIR because they said, all right, who are we going to have in our organization do these analyses? Oh, well, David over here is not doing anything. We'll have him do it. This is a critical thinking exercise. Risk analysis is a critical thinking exercise. And if you put someone, if you give them the job of doing this and they aren't critical thinkers, they will be miserable because it won't be fun, and they will fail. And therefore the program will fail. And I've seen this in organizations. Find the critical thinkers, right? And don't mistake intelligence for critical thinking. I know, I can picture one person in particular in mind. Many of you will know them because they're a name in the industry. I'm not going to name them. Incredibly smart, but couldn't critically think their way out of a wet paper sack. I mean, again, they are really smart and they can run circles around me in various things regarding intelligence, but critical thinking involves dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty and being able to see things from different perspectives and not seeing the world black and white. All right, so if you're looking at who should be doing this within your organization, find the critical thinker. If you don't do that, don't bother. Seriously. And then tools. Well, data. All right, we all have data. Nobody doesn't have data. Everybody has enough data, but some organizations have less data. And even if you have crap data, all right, that's the technical term, you can still do this, but you will do this with greater uncertainty. Your ranges will be wider and that sort of thing. And that is the simple fact. That doesn't change when you wave a wet finger in there. Do you think, you know, these kinds of measurements, the wet fingers in there, aren't reliant on data? Of course they are. How otherwise would you choose high, medium, or low? You just don't know what data you've just applied, right? So any amount of data with any amount of thought put around it is going to be better than this, right? The fact that you have uncertainty in the data, that is just your natural state and condition. Deal with it. And fortunately, there are ways of dealing with that very effectively that are empirically proven. And again, Douglas Hubbard does a marvelous job in his books about talking about dealing with uncertainty in data and calibrated estimations and whatnot. So you have the data you have. You have enough data. Would you like more? Of course. You will get there, but you have to have a starting point. If you're waiting for when you have enough data, you will never start, guaranteed. And then the last one is tools, and you notice the question mark there. Thank you. Again, when I started applying FAIR, very rudimentary, I didn't even have a spreadsheet at the time. It was whiteboards, and it was incredibly helpful as a starting point. Does it scale? No, right? But it's a place to start, and we had tremendous value from that in terms of better understanding the problems we faced, being better able to communicate to management and that sort of thing. So there's that very simplest starting point, and then you can evolve from there. So from the models, again, there are models and there are models. And you will hear the old saying, right? All models are broken. I would actually modify, I think that's frankly a misstatement or a misrepresentation. No models are perfect. All models are simplifications of reality. But some models are just flat broken. There's a difference. How many of you in here have seen my presentation, a presentation of mine where I talk about NIST 800-30? A few of you? I can show you a point in 800-30 that is just flat broken. 2/3 of the time, NIST 800-30, table G5, will give you an inaccurate answer by design. That's not imprecise. That's not imperfect. That's broken. CVSS, broken. Okay? So we have to understand that there are models and there are models in terms of their quality. So again, thinking about sort of a starting point for an organization, along the vertical axis we have skills, data, and tools, and sort of levels of maturity within them, right? So for skills, we can have maybe one person who part-time does this stuff. They've been trained. We're going to assume they've been trained. If they aren't going to be trained, they shouldn't be doing this. So maybe you have severe resource constraints. You have someone doing this part-time. Wonderful. You're still ahead. And you can eventually, perhaps after you've shown value to the organization from this, you'll get the resources to have someone who's doing it full-time. From a data perspective, maybe you're starting with really sparse data, calibrated subject matter expertise, but you can evolve from there over time. You have a starting point. And there are industry resources like our friends at Scientia and Verizon DBIR who put out wonderful data. They're incredibly useful for these sorts of things. That's sort of these data libraries or industry resources, or they could be internally generated libraries that you generate as an organization through the analyses you perform, on the way up to, as our security telemetry evolves, being able to leverage that more effectively. And then tools, again, maybe you start with spreadsheets or homegrown things or commercial tools. But you have options here. There is no single right starting point. But let's say your starting point is, well, we don't have resources for full-time. We'll just have this person over here trained, and we'll turn to them when we need these kinds of analyses done. And maybe we're just operating from calibrated subject matter expertise estimates. Again, we're miles ahead of this. And maybe you're just using a whiteboard. Okay, that works. Then as you demonstrate value, maybe you get a dedicated person. Maybe you're still operating primarily from calibrated subject matter expert estimates. But then maybe you get the money for a commercial app so you can scale and do things more efficiently and more easily, right? My point here is there's a continuum here, an opportunity to define a starting point that fits your organization's needs and constraints, and you can evolve from there. But all roadmaps begin with that why. What problem are we trying to solve? You need to nail that, and you need people who are trained. If they're not trained, then I wouldn't bother. So considerations, executive support. If you choose the right why, you will get this. If you solve problems sooner rather than later by not being, in analysis paralysis, by chasing perfect data, this can make a huge difference in the next consideration, which is budget. And then you should also think about the cultural considerations, the monetary considerations or constraints, and maybe personalities within your organization that can be obstacles, right? And strategize with people who understand your organization maybe even better than you do, or have been successful in instituting change in your organization, in dealing effectively with those obstacles rather than butting your head against them, which was my MO for years. And then again, critical thinking skills, got to have that. And keep this in mind. Everything is difficult before they are easy. Right? This is true about everything. Sometimes it takes longer, and sometimes it takes less time, but this is always true. And the first steps are the hardest. Invariably, the first analyses you do are going to feel hard. Guaranteed. Heads up. Be prepared. But it gets easier. It gets easier because you get better at it. These are skills. It gets easier because as you do these, you're generating data. You're finding data that can be reused, right? You're getting wins, hopefully, and getting more support and that sort of thing. So it gets easier. Just start doing analyses. So wrapping up very quickly because I'm at time. At the end of the day, where do you want to be? Where does your organization want to be? Which of these curves? We know how you get to the better curve here. It's through better decision making and application resources. You just have to decide and help your organization decide which curve to be on. So, I don't know, did I leave time for questions, or are we? Yeah, we'll do questions at the end. So at any rate, I hope you found this halfway interesting and useful, and moving on to the next thing.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jack.